Corey Hensley never saw the first punch coming. He'd left the hospital parking garage stairwell, heading for his bike after visiting his sister in the IQ, and 3 men closed in around him before he'd made it halfway across the second level, dragging him down between 2 parked cars before he could get his bearings. Nobody on that level stepped in, except a 72-year-old homeless woman named Bernice Talmadge, who'd been sleeping in a folded lawn chair behind the stairwell for 6 months, and who threw herself over him without a moment's hesitation. What Bernice did in the next 90 seconds would bring 500 Hells Angels to Coldbrook Regional Medical Center. By the following evening, Coldbrook, Georgia's hospital parking garage had a reputation among hospital staff for being poorly lit on its upper levels. A problem the county had been promising to fix for 2 years without much progress. Security cameras covering only the entrance and exit ramps rather than the levels themselves. It had become, over recent months, the site of a quiet string of robberies targeting anyone walking to their vehicle alone after dark. A pattern hospital administration had been slow to publicly acknowledge for fear of alarming visitors already dealing with enough stress. Corey Hensley, 26 and 6 months into his full patch with the Ridgemont chapter of the Hells Angels, had been visiting his older sister nightly since a car accident put her in intensive care 2 weeks earlier, always parking on the second level because it was closest to the elevator bank, a habit that had made him predictable in exactly the way the garage's recent attackers were counting on. Bernice Talmadge had worked as a certified nursing assistant for over 30 years before arthritis in both hands ended her career earlier than she'd planned, spending most of that career on this same hospital's 3rd floor before her retirement, a fact none of the current staff walking past her folded chair each night had any way of knowing. She had lost her housing 18 months ago when her daughter, who she'd been living with, died suddenly of a stroke, and the apartment lease reverted to a landlord who wanted her out within the month, leaving Bernice with nowhere else to turn on short notice and a pension too small to secure a new lease of her own. She had been sleeping in the hospital parking garage for 6 months, choosing it specifically because the covered upper levels kept the worst of the weather off her, and because something about being close to a hospital, even from the outside, felt marginally safer than the alternatives she'd tried first. A proximity that had once meant something entirely different to her when she still wore scrubs and a badge. Before we get to what Bernice actually did once she saw those 3 men, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to that second level of the parking garage, where a homeless grandmother with nothing left to lose was about to prove she still had more courage than 3 grown men combined, because what happened next would change considerably more than just that one terrifying night. Terrell Banks, 22, and 2 friends had been working the Coldbrook Regional Garage for nearly 2 months, targeting solo visitors leaving late at night for cash, phones, and anything else worth grabbing fast before running for the stairwell exit. A pattern that had generated 4 separate police reports without yet producing a single arrest. The garage's poor lighting and thin camera coverage making it an easy, low-risk target. They picked Corey specifically because his routine had become predictable, watching from a stairwell landing 2 nights earlier to confirm his schedule before making their move, timing the attack for the exact window each night when the level ran emptiest. Corey got 1 good hit in before the numbers overwhelmed him, and within moments he was pinned between 2 parked cars, Tyrell's knee against his chest while the other 2 searched his jacket for a wallet. His shouts muffled by a hand pressed hard over his mouth. Bernice heard the struggle from her folded chair 30 feet away, a sound she recognized instantly from decades of urgent codes and combative patients on hospital floors far calmer than this parking level, and was up and moving before her own knees, stiff from the concrete and the cold, had fully agreed to cooperate. She didn't shout a warning first. She crossed the distance as fast as her body allowed, and threw herself directly over Corey's exposed head and shoulders, absorbing the next 2 kicks meant for him across her own back and ribs, curling her own body as tightly around his as her arthritis would allow. "Get off him," she said, her voice cracking, but not backing down. Tyrell shoved her hard enough to knock her sideways into a parked car, the impact knocking the wind out of her. But she got back over Corey before he could land another hit, refusing to let 3 grown men land a single blow she could physically place her own body between. A hospital security guard doing his rounds on the level below heard the commotion and radioed for backup before running up the stairwell himself, and the 3 men scattered the moment his flashlight swept across the level, running for a stairwell exit before campus police could cut them off entirely. By the time paramedics reached them, Bernice was in considerably worse shape than Corey, a fractured wrist and severe bruising across her back, and ribs that her 72-year-old body would need far longer to recover from than Corey's own bruising would require. Corey, still shaken but largely uninjured thanks to Bernice's intervention, refused to let hospital staff separate him from her, riding down to the emergency room beside her stretcher and giving the intake nurse every detail he could manage about what she'd just done for a stranger she'd never met. "She didn't know me at all," Corey told the nurse, his voice thick. "She got up off a lawn chair in a parking garage to take a beating meant for me." The nurse, taking Bernice's information, found no permanent address, no emergency contact, and no family listed anywhere in her intake history. Corey called his chapter president, Reeve Alcott, from his own hospital bed that same night, and Reeve, hearing the full account, made calls of his own before the night was through. Word moved through the Ridgemont chapter and beyond it within hours. A homeless grandmother taking a beating meant for a member landing with a weight that needed no further explanation for anyone who heard it. Engines. That was the sound filling Coldbrook Regional's parking lot the following evening. 500 Hells Angels arriving from chapters across 3 states, filling every available space around the hospital's main entrance and lining the street for blocks beyond it. They hadn't come for spectacle. They came because a 72-year-old woman with nowhere else to sleep had thrown her own body between 3 attackers and a stranger wearing colors she'd never worn herself. And every rider standing in that lot understood exactly what that kind of debt was worth. Reeve organized a rotating visitor schedule, so Bernice was never alone during visiting hours. Riders taking shifts even through the overnight hours, and a fund he started that same evening raised, within a week, enough to cover her medical bills along with a full year of secure housing. Donations arriving from riders in 3 states who had never once set foot in Coldbrook. Coldbrook police, working from hospital security footage and the pattern of prior reports, identified Terrell Banks and both accomplices within days. And all 3 were charged with aggravated assault and a string of prior robbery counts once investigators connected the garage's earlier unsolved cases to the same 3 men. Tyrell, facing the most serious charges as the one who'd struck Bernice directly, pleaded guilty 7 months later to a sentence carrying 4 years. The judge noting from the bench that assaulting an elderly homeless woman attempting to protect a stranger represented exactly the kind of cowardice the courts needed to answer seriously. Bernice moved into a proper apartment 3 weeks later, secured by the chapter's fund and a standing arrangement covering her rent for as long as she needed it. And the hospital, prompted by the publicity, finally fixed the lighting on the garage's upper levels within the month, a repair the county had delayed for 2 years until one night made the cost of delay impossible to ignore any longer. Additional cameras installed on every level rather than just the ramps this time. Hospital administration also quietly reinstated Bernice as a part-time patient companion on the same floor she'd once worked. A role that let her use 30 years of experience without the physical demands full nursing work would have required of hands that could no longer manage it. Corey visits Bernice every week now, and has taken to calling her nothing but the toughest Sina Coldbrook ever had. a title she waves off every time, while clearly enjoying it anyway. She has a standing seat at every Ridgemont cookout, and told Reeve at the first one that it was the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had thought to save her a seat, instead of simply making room for her to occupy one. A homeless grandmother threw herself between 3 attackers and a stranger wearing colors she'd never worn herself. 500 bikers made sure she never had to sleep in a parking garage again. If you believe courage doesn't require a home address to matter, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.